Is your name Dirk?
No, I'm Jonathan.
Jonathan? Jonathan.
Jonathan. Lieutenant Jonathan Kendrick.
Jonathan.
Jonathan? Johnny.
Jonathan?
Mr. Jonathan.
Hello, I'm Jonathan.
Jonathan. Lieutenant Jonathan. Lieutenant Jonathan. Lieutenant Jonathan.
I'm Jonathan's mother.
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Bye, Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan. Hey, Jonathan.
Jonathan.
What's your name?
Jonathan.
Jonathan what?
Jonathan Niles.
Well, Jonathan. Jonathan, if I told Jonathan we're... I thought we're Jonathan. Jonathan's one of us.
Jonathan.
Hi, I'm Jonathan.
Jonathan.
I'm Jonathan.
This is Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Very good, Jonathan. Jonathan.
Of your brother Jonathan. Just the thought of Jonathan frightens me.
Oh, Jonathan? Oh, he's probably in prison or hanged or something by now. Jonathan?
It's Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
You're Jonathan. Jonathan.
Holy mackerel. It is Jonathan.
Jonathan. It was Jonathan. Brother Jonathan. Jonathan just walked in.
I don't mean Jonathan.
And we haven't had a minute, what with Jonathan in the house.
Jonathan, I've got some very good news for you. Jonathan is leaving.
Jonathan. No, Jonathan, you know what Jonathan is doing? Jonathan.
Jonathan, stop telling me about Jonathan. I'll take care of Jonathan. You...
The Jonathan.
Jonathan would like to share. I'm proud of you, Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
I'm Jonathan.
Jonathan.
This is your father, Jonathan.
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 Jonathan's a little out of control. The floor.
Jonathan.
Bar Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Hi, Jonathan.
I see Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan. Yeah, what's your name? Jacob. Jacob. All right. Well, you don't mind being Jonathan, do you?
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
My name is Jonathan.
Jonathan.
I know you want answers, Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Oh, Jonathan.
How you doing today, Jonathan?
Come on, Jonathan. Jonathan.
Hey, it's Jonathan.
Jonathan shit in the front room here.
Either Jonathan goes or I go.
Feed Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
And Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Well done, Jonathan.
Jonathan's. Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Oh, I'm Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan, stop.
Jonathan.
Jonathan's shit, Jonathan.
Jonathan killed Paul with a sword.
Jonathan's.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
What the fuck's his name? Jonathan?
Jonathan. Deeper. Jonathan.
Jonathan. You and Jonathan.
Bounce, Jonathan.
Jonathan. We've come to visit Mr. Jonathan. 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 Jonathan.
And Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan. Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan. Your brother's name was Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
And Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Sorry, Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan. Jonathan.
And for the murder of Jonathan.
Jonathan.
And Jonathan.
Jonathan with Jonathan.
Hello, Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan. Jonathan. Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
My friend Jonathan.
Thank God you're here. I'm Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Yeah, I had to go to Jonathan.
Jonathan's. Jonathan.
Sounds like Jonathan.
Jonathan. Oh, Jonathan. Damn it, Jonathan. Jonathan.
Mrs. Jonathan.
Jonathan. With Jonathan. For Jonathan.
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 Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Local college football star Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Well, Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Jonathan. Reverend Jonathan.
I'm Jonathan.
Jonathan, you...
And Jonathan. Where's Jonathan?
Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan. He's Jonathan. Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Bye, Jonathan.
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 Jonathan. Jonathan what?
Jonathan. Jonathan.
Love Jonathan.
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 So glad that you finally got that gender reassignment surgery, Jennifer. I mean, Jonathan.